Last season was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was a very schizophrenic season, and I think a lot of that was governed by I think the level of funding that the team has and sort of the money ball aspect that they had to employ last year. And what I mean by that is, they've got a tremendous experienced coach in Colin Clark, and Colin's methods appeal to some folks and they don't appeal to others. But the one thing you can't argue with is that he generally has success everywhere he goes. He can take any bad team and make them a good team. He's sort of maybe the Larry Brown of NASL soccer. But the problem is that because of the player acquisition strategy they had to do, which was trying to avoid high-priced veterans who may or may not perform. They had a lot of trialists. They waited to acquire players late into the preseason. This was a concerted strategy. They had a number of players who were under club options for last year, so they were able to bring back their core because of that. Of course, some of those had ballooned salaries, so they had to be very smart about who they acquired after that. So what happened was, not to belabor this too much, they started out the season with some pretty severe holes in defense and particularly in attack. They had a great goalkeeper. They had a tremendous midfield. Carolina always has a good midfield. But they had some holes, and they weren't scoring goals, and they were giving up goals. And then they had a few players that they acquired the third or fourth game of the season, Mike Gorella and Tony Stoll, who came in and really sealed up some problems, but it took a while to integrate them. Well, those guys were apparently signed to mid to half season contracts, and they were not able to agree to terms for the fall season. So they left at mid-season. So then you're looking to plug the hole again. Meanwhile, Zach Schlowski's having one of his best years since he's come to Carolina. Then he leaves shortly into the fall season to go to law school. So then you're having to replace him. They had been working on a contract to bring in Nacho Novo from Scotland for months, and that got delayed for various reasons, a lot of it being immigration paperwork. And so he didn't come in as soon as they wanted to. They were worried about scoring, so they had Cesar Elizondo, who was performing well, but they had a lot of guys who played his position. So they made a trade to bring in Danny Barrera, who they saw as a better scoring option. He didn't quite produce. But then late in the season, they managed to bring in Devin Sandoval on loan, who was a godsend, and it just helped out. So I guess my point is sort of the cyclical nature of Carolina's season was born from this stop-start situation that they had. So you ended up having a team who finished fourth in the spring season, finished out a 23-game home unbeaten streak that was broken in the quarterfinals of the U.S. Open Cup. They beat the LA Galaxy for the third consecutive year in the U.S. Open Cup. This time with Robbie Keane and Landon Donovan and every starter except Omar Gonzalez playing, because he was away at the World Cup at the time. They beat Chivas USA for the second straight year, and then they got knocked out by FC Dallas. So you had that. Then you get to the fall season, and they lose to India 11 at home. They lose to the Atlanta Silverbacks at home. They lost to Tampa at home. Brutal home losses, any one of which could have turned the team's fortunes, because they ended up finishing fifth in the overall point standing, 2 points behind Fort Lauderdale, which, by the way, they drew a home match with Fort Lauderdale late in the season, which if that had been flipped to a win, we would have been in the playoffs, or the Railhawks would have been in the playoffs. So that it was one of those seasons. I'll give you a quick. This is the encapsulation of the Railhawks season. That they get a chance to play the LA Galaxy for the third straight year. This time it's in round 3 instead of round 4 of the Open Cup. Which 2 years ago they played the Galaxy for the first time at the Open Cup, and it was one of those transformative events in the team's history, because it had just undergone an ownership change. They got to play the Galaxy. Everybody in the market thought Beckham was coming to town, which obviously he wasn't. But they sold out that game in Wake Med Soccer Park, which then the capacity was between 7,000 and 8,000 fans in a day. It was unbelievable. It accelerated some expansion that was already in the works. They brought tons of attention to the team. It was tremendous. So they had the Galaxy come to town. Landon Donovan had already been quoted as saying that they were sick of losing to the Railhawks, which was just like gold here when that came out. I mean, you can't buy that quote. But they had to move the game to one of the practice fields at Wake Med Soccer Park and out of the main stadium because the town of Cary, who maintains the soccer park, was resodding the main stadium, which they had to in anticipation of that fall's men's college cup, NCAA college cup. So you advance in the U.S. Open Cup, you've got Donovan and King coming to town, and you end up having to have it on a practice field with temporary bleachers brought in. You squeeze 3,000 fans in there when you potentially could have had 10,000 in the main stadium. So I think that little story right there sort of summarizes the Railhawks season to me. Yeah, I would say if you had to draw a midline as far as good or bad, the Railhawks are probably in the middle, maybe slightly on the lower half. Now, there's two ways of looking at this, and I'm going to start out with the sort of the optimistic view. When Traffic acquired the team and when the Wellmans were ownership, tons of money under the Wellmans was expended on player personnel. Martin Rennie was the manager then. They were buying players relative to the rest of the league left and right. But they had a different strategy on marketing, very new age, online. They gutted a lot of the grassroots marketing. And because of that, by 2010, which was the last year that they owned the team, the average attendance was around 2,600 a game. So any assessment of the Railhawks market penetration and average attendance now has to be viewed through that prism, because that you have to look at where they've come in the last 3 or 4 years when they averaged 2,600 a game. It was bad. Last year, every year since Traffic and Kirk Johnson came on board, there's been a steady increase in attendance. Last year was almost even with 2013, which was a little disconcerting. The average attendance last year was only about 4,600. There was a sharp difference between the spring and the fall. The spring average attendance was about 5,400. They set a regular season attendance record against the Tampa Bay Rowdies on May 30th, I believe it was, of about 7,900. And then the fall average was between 41 and 4,200. And I guess there's a host of reasons for that. That's probably a good topic for another day. But while there was a little bit of marking time last year, I still choose to view all of that from the perspective of where they've come from in the last 3 or 4 years. I know there's been an increase in grassroots marketing. One of the things Kurt Johnson did when he took over was attempt to reconnect to a lot of different entities that had probably been ignored for the several years before that. Soccer academies, broadcast partners, corporate sponsors. Not that none of that had been going on, but there was a lot of bridges that had been burned. And so a lot of that had to be reconstructed. Now, what the Railhawks challenge is now, quite frankly, is to try to find a way to move to the next step and to realize it and to have the people involved from a front office and an ownership point of view who have the vision to do that. And that's going to be the big determining factor. Okay, well, let's start with what the Railhawks have been up to. You're probably going to hear my hook early before I've even written the preseason article on this year, because training camp just started this week for Carolina, which is a whole other subject and maybe a small source of angst for the local supporters here. They just started. Of course, with the weather that they've had the last 2 weeks here in North Carolina, they probably wouldn't have been doing much outdoor practice anyway. If it snows 2 inches here, we're paralyzed for a week. The Railhawks have undergone a bit of player upheaval over the offseason. A lot of the player options from last year expired. They picked up a few options for some existing players, and then they let a lot of the players from last year go. Frankly, the team is going to be older this year. I think there's probably going to be a record number of players who are 30 and over, and there's more that are coming on. We can talk about that in a minute. But what I like to say is that while there are a number of dynamic players on the team, my early take on this year's roster is that it would be a championship roster in 2012. If the players that Carolina brought in, if you could teleport that back about 2-3 years ago, it would be one of the best off seasons you've ever seen in this league. The problem is that when you look at Tampa and you look at Minnesota and you look at New York and even to a certain extent San Antonio, you can't compete with that. And I mean, they're bringing in, MLS players for 6-figure salaries, and we're getting aging NASLers who are hoping to refine their form. Last year we had 2 really good goalkeepers in Akira Fitzgerald and Scott Goodwin. Goodwin is, for all intents and purposes, unless something dramatic happens, gone. The word was he'd gotten married. He was going to go to Europe, but I know he just finished a trial with DC United that he didn't get the job, from my understanding. He may trial with another MLS club, but I've heard no indication he's coming back to Carolina. Akira Fitzgerald's been signed by NYCFC, probably to be their backup, but Akira's a tremendous keeper and a really great guy. So, we had 2 great keepers last year, both of whom saw significant time. They've been replaced thus far this year by Hunter Gilstrap, who was a veteran with the Pittsburgh Riverhounds. They have a young prospect, Brian Silvestri, who was once part of the Whitecaps Academy. I keep hearing they're going to bring in a 3rd keeper. I know that they had come to terms with another young keeper who found another job somewhere else in a higher division, so he's not coming. In the midfield, it's interesting. Carolina was stocked last year. They had Cesar Elizondo, who's gone. They traded for Danny Barrera, who's gone. Enzo Martinez is now gone and signed with Charlotte Independence. But they have restocked at midfield. And by the way, June Marcus Davidson, the holding midfielder, he's gone too. But what they've done is restocked. They've signed Neil Halavity, who's an NASL veteran, but a former best 11 and a good holding midfielder who they have very high hopes for. Wells Thompson, a former MLS player, played for Charlotte last year, but he's a North Carolina native and has he's an MLS vet. Still have Nazmi Al-Badawi, who had a tremendous rookie season for Carolina, one of the youngsters that we still have. And he came along quite nicely in the offseason. And but the 2 key players, one of which is a returning vet and always my favorite, is T. Shipolani, who has long been a favorite of mine. I still believe he's one of the most potent offensive threats in this league. And he is returning again. The other player they acquired that I was extremely happy about was Mark Anderson, who is only 26 years old. His first season with Fort Lauderdale was 2012, and he was an MVP caliber player that year. Injuries killed his 2013. He returned to some form last year with Fort Lauderdale and was a good contributor, but kind of got lost in the shadow of Fafa Piquel. So he decided to come to Carolina, where he knows he's going to be a focal point of the offense. And I have long been a Mark Anderson fan, and I couldn't be more excited that he's going to be here. Forwards, it's interesting. Nacho Novo's back, who he showed good form last year at forward, considering the fact that he's ancient. But he's a good player, and I think he's, if his health can hold up, he's going to be a good contributor for the team. He's still wily, he's very savvy, and he's a pro. You watch him in practice and in games, he's smarter than everybody else on the field. So it's a question of whether his health holds out. And of course, we've acquired someone, Simone Bracalello, who I don't know how much tread on the tires Simone still has, but he's going to have to find it this year because he conceivably could be one of the key contributors for the team. There's a few other minor contributors still coming in. I can tell you that there's probably going to be an announcement tomorrow where there's 3 key players, I think, that are being signed by Carolina. One is the return of Austin DeLuz, who was a team captain in 2013, decided to try his hand with Orlando City last year. His return to MLS didn't turn out, so he's back to Carolina. And in a stock midfield where you've got folks who can play attack and play holding midfield, DeLuz is a sharp, possession-oriented midfielder who should fit well within that framework. Chris Nurse is going to be coming back to Carolina. This will be his 8th consecutive year in second division soccer, and he seems to go somewhere different every year. He's more of a depth guy now. He's a midfielder. He's away playing international soccer right now with the Guyana national team, so he won't arrive to camp till late March. But Chris is a great guy. He's a good locker room guy, and he's a good depth player. So he's the kind of player that Carolina needed to bring in. And then the last one that I'm particularly excited about, particularly since defense is, again, a big hole for Carolina, Footy Danso, who has spent the last 4 years in Major League Soccer, most of it with the Portland Timbers. He got traded to Montreal Impact in the middle of last year. Footy has a lot of North Carolina connections. When he first immigrated from Gambia, he did so to play soccer at North Carolina Wesleyan College. He moved on soon after that. He played a year for the Carolina U23 team in 2008, eventually went to the Portland USL1 club, went to their MLS club, and I think Footy Danso is a tremendous player. Now, he's 31 years old now, but I think in second division, he could be a huge addition, particularly since the Railhawks defense is still suspect. Capono Lowe is a tremendous player. He's Mr. Railhawk. He's back again. He's the only original Railhawk still on the roster, and he'll probably be the left back starter again. The team does not have a definite right back yet. And at center back, essentially it's Daniel Scott, Connor Tobin, Austin King, and Footy Danso, hopefully. So, those are 3 huge signings that we should be, I'll have a post tomorrow and there'll be a formal announcement tomorrow, but I couldn't be happier about those because they're going to help the team tremendously. He's a great guy. I remember a quick story about Connor from last year in that LA Galaxy game. We were all gathered around the locker room waiting for Landon Donovan to come out and interview, which took forever. And all of a sudden, over my shoulder, I noticed Connor Tobin was standing there. And, everybody exchanged kits, and they'd gone to the locker room, and this was on the practice field, so it's out on the concourse. It's not in the tunnel or anything. And so I looked at Connor, and I said, "What the heck are you doing here?" He said, "I'm waiting for Robbie Rogers to come out." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because," and I won't get too detailed, but essentially he had a family member who was gay, and he wanted to get Robbie Rogers' shirt to give it to his family member. And I just thought that was interesting, and it told me a lot about him as a person, that he was going to that degree. And so all the stories that I've heard over the offseason about him being sort of the forefront of lobbying for the players and doing that sort of thing, doesn't surprise me. And whatever pros and cons that he may have on the field, I think having locker room guys like him is invaluable.